Hello, class. I'm here to talk about Module 2, the disease models of addiction. So without further ado, we will go ahead and share that screen. And get it up to the slideshow. So today we're going to talk about the disease models of addiction. Let's get into the objectives. The first thing we'll talk about is to identify the common aspects of the disease models. All of the disease models, I mean, there's multiple models, and we'll talk about those, but they all are going to coalesce around certain ideas, and we'll get into those today with Objective 1. We'll explain then the susceptibility model, or the genetic origins of addiction, and that will be today's lecture. The objectives 3 and 4 will come in the next lecture. Okay, objective number 1 is to identify the common aspects of the disease model. So just want to kind of round out what the disease models sort of look like. Okay, so an overview of the disease models. The disease models are the #1 way of understanding addiction in the US. I mean, the likelihood that you ask anybody about addiction, what causes addiction, what causes substance abuse, what causes substance use disorder, that is going to, they're going to basically say that it's a disease. Many people will say that. It's also extremely popular in treatment communities and treatment programs. For example, we talked about Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And you remember probably from the last chapter that they had this concept of the allergy. Certain people had an allergy, and that made them susceptible to addiction in the way that other users were not. So rehabilitation centers, popularly known as rehabs, often espouse the disease model as well. Addiction in the disease model is viewed as a chronic condition. So we're going to talk a little bit later in this module about AA. And the #1, the first step of AA is to see oneself as having a loss of control. It is a disease that goes on for a long time. So chronic is this idea that it goes on for a very long time, even post-abstinence. One who is addicted will always be addicted. One manages their addiction, but they do not cure addiction. This concept of loss of control is also really huge with the disease model, and that's the idea that if you use any of the substance, even just a tiny little bit, you're going to go full blown and use and have no control over further use. Therefore, the disease models usually require abstinence by way of treatment. So meaning that you just have to stop altogether and not do it at all anymore, as opposed to moderate use, which we'll talk about. Finally, it's associated with decreased stigma. If a person has a disease, I mean, it's like having diabetes or cancer or something like that, right? So you can't really blame the person for having a disease. Okay, so there are a couple of different disease models. One is the concept of susceptibility. And that's the susceptibility models basically say that some people are more genetically vulnerable to addiction. This is sort of another way of saying that allergy theory of AA, which was that some people are sort of born such that if they consume this substance, they will get addicted, and other people are not going to get addicted even if they use the substance. Another disease model is an exposure model. So rather than being susceptible per se because of some genetic makeup, the idea here is that when you take a substance, the chemical acts on the brain and causes it to function abnormally, causing the disease. So in fact, the substance causes the disease. So for example, if you were to take methamphetamine, that would change your brain and cause the disease. So susceptibility comes before you ever even consume the substance, right? If you have a disease prior to consuming the substance, and exposure says that the disease is actually caused by the substance itself. In general, these two focus on different aspects of disease, so they're pretty complementary in the sense that one could have both the vulnerability and the exposure also changes the brain in ways that are make it more difficult to function. Okay, so the disease models generally have a concept of physiological dependence. So the person who becomes addicted develops a dependence on the drug or the substance. And that dependence is fostered by neuroadaptation, meaning that the brain actually changes and it causes a process of tolerance where you need more of the drug, and problems with withdrawal, so that you'll get symptoms if you stop using the drug. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about those processes that happen in the brain with regard to tolerance and withdrawal. Okay, so tolerance is just needing to use more of the substance, which increasing that use over time in order to get the same effect. So those of you who, for example, have smoked marijuana may have found that early on in smoking marijuana, you developed a real intense high that involved some cognitive changes and changes in perception of time, and maybe you even got the munchies really bad and ate a whole bunch of stuff. But then later on, with continued use, you may find that in fact you don't, you're less, you get less of a high. You need to actually use more. Where one puff did it in the beginning, now you can smoke a lot of marijuana and still get that same effect. You don't get more of an intense effect. So tolerance is really a symptom of substance use disorder, and it is one of the symptoms that we covered from the DSM diagnosis. Now, the thing about tolerance, it is one symptom of 12 symptoms. So because you really only need 2 to be diagnosed, then really tolerance is not required for a diagnosis. Though, tolerance and withdrawal are going to be there in a lot of cases of substance use disorder. So recognize, though, it's not required for diagnosis. It is a symptom. Withdrawal is a related symptom, and that's when the substance leaves the body after prolonged use. So you've been using, and you decide to stop using, and now you have a set of symptoms. And those symptoms are associated with the brain literally having made changes that we'll talk about. And now it doesn't have the substance, so the brain is reacting to that. So we see a whole range of symptoms that can include, sweating, insomnia, anxiety, depression, even hallucinations, and even death can happen. It depends a lot on the substance and the level of use. You may have heard of delirium tremens associated with alcohol withdrawal. That is particular to alcohol withdrawal, and you don't tend to see it in the other with use of other substances. And some drugs show very little withdrawal. It depends on how quickly they clear from the system. So, for example, with cannabis, it doesn't clear from the system very quickly. And so because it's stored in fat in the body, it clears very slowly. And so there you get a less intense withdrawal from cannabis. Whereas, for example, cocaine and heroin, you get a more intense withdrawal. again, withdrawal is a symptom of substance use disorder. It is not required for a diagnosis, and that's important because not everyone with the substance use disorder is going to have withdrawal. However, again, more serious cases are going to feature withdrawal. Now, remember that SUD is classified according to severity, and severity is you can find that out by knowing how many of those 12 symptoms in the DSM-5 that the person has. Okay. All right, let's get into objective number 2, which is to talk about the susceptibility model or the genetic origins of addiction. Well, basically, addiction runs in families. And so that we suspect already is going to be a genetic, have some genetic basis. So there's tons of evidence for familial transmission. But that doesn't necessarily mean genetic, because families are often, family members are often in the same environments, but it does make you suspect. So usually they do twin studies with monozygotic twins, meaning identical twins, compared to dizygotic twins, which are non-identical twins. And because monozygotic twins share all of 100% of their genetic material, and dizygotic twins are only going to share 50%, we would expect, if the disorder is genetically mediated, that monozygotic twins would be more likely, if one of them turns out to be addicted, that the other one would also be addicted. So we do see that. We see that in comparison to dizygotic twins, monozygotic twins are more likely to share the same diagnoses. So again, that's evidence that the disorder does have a genetic component. And drug use and alcohol use does seem to have strong genetic components. That doesn't mean it's the whole story. So if you're even monozygotic twins are not always concordant for substance use disorder. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how genes and the environment work together, because the environment is very, very important, though the susceptibility model really only gives it short shrift. It doesn't talk about the environment that much, but the environment turns out to be very important. So part of the reason is because genes and environment interact. There's a bidirectional causal effect on genes and the environment. They are influencing one another. So let's talk about genotype versus phenotype. Genotype is one's unique arrangement of genes, unique sequence of DNA that is built into every cell of your body, and you have a unique set of genes, and that is your genotype. Your phenotype is what shows basically the expression of the genes, and that's one's traits and individual characteristics, and those are influenced phenotype is influenced not just by genes, but also by the environment. So a person is born into an environment, and the way that those genes are expressed are going to be affected by that environment. There's a big effect of the environment. So the upshot of that is that genes and environment are both important, and they do influence one another. And we'll talk a little bit more about, we know that, most people can imagine how genes influence environment by, making you more likely to seek out certain environments than others. But it's hard sometimes for people to imagine how environment may come back and influence your genetics. But we'll talk about that. The substance use disorder is a polygenic disorder. Poly meaning many genes, right? It's a complex disorder that involves variations in multiple genes combined with environmental influences. So it's not really easy to piece apart genetically. And we have made some progress there, but not a ton of progress. It's not addiction is not a simple disease like, for example, Huntington's disease or sickle cell disease, where we have a single gene. We do not have that with addiction. We have multiple genes. So we can't really say, we can say that, certain kinds of genetic makeups seem to influence the likelihood of addiction, but they certainly don't determine it. And they certainly don't, there's not any single gene determination, or they also don't cause it don't cause addiction on their own. It requires an environment. Okay, so I told you I was going to talk about the effect of the environment on on a person's genetic makeup, and that effect is called epigenetics. And so what we see is that substance use during one's life, for example, me as an adult woman, uses a substance that can alter my gene expression. So it doesn't take away or add genes or mess with the sequence on the DNA, but it can change the way that genes are expressed. And when it changes the way that genes are expressed, it may cause different productions of proteins and things like that. So when I use substances, that can in fact alter the way that my genes work. Now, get this. These altered genes may affect me, and they may cause me to seek out that substance more, okay? But another issue is that I can pass on those changes, those altered genes, to my offspring. So here you see in this diagram, the susceptibility to addiction being passed on. So this woman is smoking while she's pregnant. That may alter her own gene expression, but by doing so when she's pregnant, it is now altering the baby's genetic expression. That gets passed on, or it can get passed on. So now we have another generation of a woman who has greater susceptibility to smoking because her mother smoked during pregnancy. Not because her mother was born with that genetic susceptibility, but because she smoked during pregnancy. Now look what happens. We've got that child having another baby. And so now we've got the third generation, and still that epigenetic effect is there. So the epigenetic effect can be passed on. So EPI means above or more than genetic. So what's happening here is the environment, the smoking during pregnancy, is changing genetics, changing the expression of the genes, which is then passed on to the kid, who can then pass it on to their kid. So as you can imagine, this stuff gets complicated, right? You can't really piece out the genes versus the environment if environment is changing genes and genes are changing environment. Okay, next time we'll do objective 3. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you next time.